Everyone, and welcome. It's good to see so many happy faces. I think we're settling in to the rhythm. I've heard lots of nice comments about yesterday's dinner. Hopefully the hangovers are not too bad. But we're here this morning for a really unique opportunity to meet award-winning writer Meg Rosoff. We're so lucky to have Meg with us. I'll give a brief introduction and then Meg will give her talk, and afterwards there will be time for some discussion. And the way that will work is we have the microphone, so please raise your hand, we'll come to you and you can ask your questions. We're just waiting one moment. There we are. Good morning, Meg.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you for joining us this morning.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I wish I were in Malta.
We wish you were too, but maybe next time.
Yeah.
It seems everybody has the same sentiment, so maybe we just have to repeat this more often.
Okay, sounds good to me.
So Meg doesn't really need an introduction, but I do want to take a moment to acknowledge her enormous contribution, not only to children's literature, but also to us academics who think about children's literature critically and sometimes need a little bit of an outside perspective to remind us not to get too comfortable in our work. And I think Meg's talk entitled, "Do you think you'll ever write a real book, Troubled Children and the Trouble with Writing for Children in 2022, is going to give us just that, a little bit of a prod to think even more deeply about the work we do and how our research connects with writers' work, artists' work, and what generates the most impact. Meg was born in Boston, was educated at Harvard and St. Martin's College of Art, and has lived in London since 1989. Her first novel, How I Live Now, sold more than 1 million copies worldwide and was even turned into a feature film. She is the author of 10 novels, 4 picture books, and the McTavish series for young readers, as well as a novel for adults called Jonathan Unleashed. She has won or been shortlisted for 24 international book prizes, is a member of the Royal Society of Literature and an honorary fellow of Homerton College, Cambridge University. Meg was awarded the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award in 2016, and her most recent novel is Friends Like These, to be published. Has it been published now, Meg?
Well, it's next week in the UK. I know it's been bought for Italy, but I'm not sure when it's coming out.
Super. So everybody, have you put a note in your calendar next week? Friends Like These. And Meg lives with her husband, who is also an artist in London, Paul Hamlin. So over to you, Meg, and we'll open the floor up for questions right after. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, it's quite early. Well, it's early for me. It's not that early, really, in London. So people get terribly excited when they hear I'm a novelist. I went to an event at a very famous bookstore in London just the other week, and it was full of famous novelists, and I met a couple of people who I didn't know, and they said, "Oh, what sort of books do you write?" This is the inevitable follow-up. Now, telling people that I write books for children is nearly always met with a tolerant smile and the end of the conversation. Have you ever thought of writing an adult book, they say. At this point, I have to force myself not to stutter and prevaricate, not to say, well, but you see, my subject is adolescence, so my books are frequently categorized as YA, but mainly the people who read them are creative writing students, or adults who are interested in coming of age stories, the Bildungsroman. So it's not like I'm exactly a children's writer per se. I mean, I'm exploring what adolescence means. And of course, I've also written for adults. The children's and adults' books are mostly on the same subject, i.e., what it means to be a person. What I'm trying to say, in the most embarrassing way possible, is that I write serious books, literary books for children. Most of the time, I try to prevent myself from going into a big explanation, which is good because it sounds incredibly defensive and totally pathetic. In the end, however, it doesn't much matter. Once I mention that I write for children, people start to look over my shoulder, hoping to meet someone who does a real job, not the equivalent of working at a cat rescue. Because writing for kids isn't like writing proper books. To the general public, and sometimes even to publishers, it's barely a real job at all. Writing children's books is the sort of thing anyone can do for a hobby, like baking cakes or designing hats for dogs. Something innumerable people have told me they'd really love to try. Oh, you're a children's writer. How interesting. If all else fails, I think I'll write a children's book too. It's fashionable these days to become a children's writer in your spare time, because after all, how difficult can it be? A bit of rhyming or alliteration for your main character, Squishy the squid, Peppy the puppy, or Buddy the bear, and presto, you're in. Of course, if you're lucky enough to be a pop star, or a member of the minor royalty, or a famous football or an Instagram influencer, your book will not only get published, but you probably won't even have to write it yourself. And you might also get a huge advance. Celebrities, influencers, minor royalty. The idea that you need any particular skill to write for children seems to have gone out of fashion, skewing the market towards a kind of amateur story making based on achievement in other fields or on your number of Twitter or Instagram followers. It's all part of the process of commodifying children's books, stuffing them into the sausage machine of commerce, where a few huge publishers make bigger and bigger profits and the books become more and more anodyne. I am not the first person to complain about this. Writers spend their lives complaining about something. I think it is what writers do. However, in 1980, Maurice Sendak wrote, "We are flooded with books. Books come pouring out of the publishing meat grinder, and the quality has dropped severely. I'd much rather we just took a year off, a moratorium, no more books, for a year maybe or two, just stop publishing." But the publishing goes on. And the theory is this: children are idiots anyway. It's not like you need any special talent to write for them. And the corollary to that, children's writers are not real writers because they only write for idiots. There are two problems here. The first, of course, is that children are not idiots, and they are not simple versions of adults. They are possibly more complex version of adults, though of course they know a great deal less about finance and politics. The second problem with writing mediocre books for children is that it makes children think that that's what books are. A bit samey, a bit dull, not nearly as much fun as the internet or Fortnite. It's a well-known adage among writers and librarians that if you give a child the wrong book, they won't tell you that they don't like the book, they'll tell you that they hate to read. Now, I don't belong to the outdated contingent of English public school boys, most of whom serve in Boris Johnson's cabinet, who believe that all 8-year-olds should read Charles Dickens and Walter Scott. Fashions in books change, language changes, the world changes. How many adults have the attention span for Dickens anymore? But to write well for children requires skills at least as sophisticated as those required to write well for adults. The ability to construct a good story, originality of thought, a talent for writing, obviously, but the additional ability to tap into the psyche of young people, their sense of humor, what worries them, what frightens and delights them, the extremity of their brains. Most of the good children's writers I know tap into that because they never really left their own childhood, or in my case, adolescence. Children are hardwired to investigate the world. It's what babies do from the very beginning. They're trying to understand it. The first independent travel a small child will do is in his or her head. I read last week that a famous British actor joined forces with his sister to write a book called The Fart That Changed the World. It's had a great deal of publicity in the UK and will probably hit the bestseller lists, which should not surprise me. There have been at least 10,000 children's books written on the subject of bottoms and poo, because don't all children get a kick out of poo? But there's one classic book on the subject, a really good book, one you can bear to read over and over again, that adults like as much as children, a book that is much more than an exercise in sniggering. The Story of the Little Mole Who Knew It Was None of His Business, written in 1989 by Werner Holzwarth and Wolf Erbrook, is a strange, subtle, and weirdly anarchic book. For starters, the little mole himself is an angry picture book character, which is not something you run across very often. In picture books, children are almost never depicted as having strong emotions. In addition, the illustrations, of course, it being Wolf Erbrook, are powerful. They're not pretty or cute. It is not cozy. It is not an exercise in children are idiots anyway. Neither is Duck, Death and the Tulip, also by Wolf Erbrook, which I believe is the finest treatise on death that I have ever read by anyone for any age group. It is one of my favorite picture books because it tackles the most difficult subject in all of literature, death, without a trace of sentimentality. There are no sweet funeral scenes in this book, no children gathered around with a sparrow in a matchbox, no meaningful chats with mother about heaven. Duck, Death and the Tulip is a classic piece of literature, so challenging and thought-provoking that I'm pretty sure 9 out of 10 parents would want nothing to do with it. But they would be wrong. It is a subject that begs discussion, even with small children, particularly with small children. Another great literary picture book is Maurice Sendak's strange, almost deliriously dreamy In the Night Kitchen. It's less well known than Where the Wild Things Are and has been subject to extensive Freudian analysis. It's one of the most banned books of all time among children and adult books. It's a much weirder book than any child could fully appreciate, which may be why it upsets adults so much. It's full of references to Hitler, Stan Laurel, and the strange unconscious world of dreams. It is frightening and compelling and funny and odd. And worse, imagine it features full frontal nudity in a drawing. Do children have genitals? Not in picture books, they don't. Contrary to most of the propaganda in books for the young, Maurice Sendak wrote, childhood is only partly a time of innocence. It is, in my opinion, a time of seriousness, bewilderment, and a great deal of suffering. Roald Dahl, whose books have sold 250 million copies and often feature underdog and revenge scenarios, would agree. Kids love stories about death. They need it. They need to have stories that deal with death and to explain it as a place to put their fears. Roald Dahl has been censored hugely because of his anti-Semitic views, but it doesn't interfere with the fact that he wrote extraordinary books for children. Sean Tan's book, The Arrival, is the very definition of mute eloquence. It's a beautiful, tragical, hopeful book about being a refugee. And it is more relevant now than it was when it was written almost 20 years ago. When it won overall Book of the Year at the 2006 Sydney Writers' Festival, I overheard two publishers expressing outrage afterwards. It isn't a novel for adults. It isn't a proper novel, they said. Imagine, I thought, how difficult it must be to write a proper novel without using a single word. If anything, classic literary children's books are more fierce and more radical than literary novels published for adults. Go back to Beatrix Potter sometime if you want a truly terrifying read. The point about these books, the ones that will endure, is that the writers respect the curiosity and intelligence of children. Their job, as they see it, as we see it, is to live up to that challenge. Unfortunately, the number of children reading books is declining steadily. We all know this, and we all know why. Children are gaming, they're watching TV, they're spending more and more time online, up to 6.5 hours a day among British teenagers. Literacy across the world is up. More people are able to read, but reading for pleasure is down across all age groups and continues to decrease year on year. According to research carried out by the National Literary Trust in the UK in 2020, children today read less frequently than in any previous generation and enjoy reading less than young people in every past year. To make matters worse, enjoyment now dwindles with age. Nearly twice as many 5 to 8-year-olds as 14 to 6-year-olds said they took pleasure from reading. Some of this trend has to do quite simply with access. And of course, I'm speaking predominantly about the UK because that's where I live. That's what I have access to in terms of statistics and information. But in the UK, as of 6 months ago, nearly 1/3 of children were living in poverty, which is an appalling figure. I suspect that figure will be rising very quickly now with the rising costs of fuel. According to the Child Poverty Action Group, nearly 50% of children in single-parent families and 46% of children in Black and minority ethnic families were living in poverty. in the United Kingdom. And if families can't afford food, they can't afford books. Never mind, we think, they can always go to a library. But 800 libraries in the UK have been closed in the past decade. That's 1 in 5. As a final insult, government guidance puts huge pressure on teachers and schools to teach reading via something called synthetic phonics, which separates the technical aspects of reading from books and storytelling. This is a quote, since the introduction of the phonics screening check in 2012, the percentage of year 1 pupils meeting the expected standard in reading has risen from 58 to 82%, with 92% of children achieving this standard by year 2, crows a Department of Education spokesperson. They are talking about the ability to read a sentence. Standards in reading, however, have absolutely no correlation with enjoyment of reading. And though they may learn to read faster, they are taught to read via methods that do not involve books. The government makes it very clear that it is interested in attainment, not stories, not enjoyment. It's like teaching someone to cook without ever allowing them access to food. It has struck me on repeated occasions that the British government hates children. Some of us, however, feel differently, which is why we bang our heads against the wall and swim against the vast tide of library attrition, a falling interest in good quality children's books, and a decline in reading. I've spent the past 20 years writing books, endlessly visiting schools to talk about reading and the reasons children should read, attending book festivals, holding workshops, recommending books to kids, and writing my own books as fiercely as I can. At the same time, I tell myself that history moves on, that the world changes, that perhaps reading is an outdated form, destined for extinction, like so many other forms of human behavior. Does anyone know anyone who can fix a car anymore? My husband and I returned to the place he had worked in Nepal after 18 years away, in the middle of the Nepali election in 1994. We were walking in relatively unpopulated country, scattered with tiny remote villages. And one night we encountered a traveling bard, an actual bard like something out of a Shakespeare play. He had arrived at the village we were staying in to sing the election. As everyone in the village gathered round, my husband, who speaks Nepali, said he was describing the various positive and negative characteristics of the different parties and the different candidates. You wouldn't find anyone singing an election anymore, even in Nepal, where mobile phones have reached even the most remote villages. But we accept the loss of oral culture and oral storytelling with relatively good grace and no particular sense of cultural catastrophe. Amazon Prime, Netflix, and Apple TV offer a seemingly endless supply of video content. We are told the quality of program is better than ever in history. So why do we catastrophize the loss of reading? I am always careful about my generation's, and any older generation's, propensity to romanticize the past. Like most writers, I was a zealous reader as a child, but even back in the 1960s, I was unusual. Not all children, and of course not all adults, engaged with books then or now, just as not all people engage with football or with mathematics. I constantly wonder whether I'm like some old farmer in 1900, standing with a horse and a plow in a field, bemoaning the invention of the tractor. It will be noisy and dirty and lead to a polluted, intensively farmed world, I and Luddites like me shout. And even if I'm right, and I do believe I'm right, catastrophizing the future doesn't stop it from happening. It just makes you look like a crazy old fool. So why should children be encouraged to read? Over the past 3.5 millennia, humans have been entirely at peace for only 268 years, or 8% of recorded history. This is not a good record. We are a species of warmongering, compulsive consumers. We reliably choose greed, tribalism, and violence over altruism and peace. And within a couple of 100 years of inventing the power loom, we are in the process of making life on Earth uninhabitable. Against all odds, however, we retain the hope that things might get better. I would call this the triumph of hope over experience, but it is one of the most enduring and endearing and necessary stories Homo sapien tells ourselves about being human. The story of hope is the reason we go on. Tipping the scales towards optimism requires immense fine-tuning of the human brain. It requires education, imagination, compassion, self-discipline, the emotional and intellectual tools, at least to try to improve life on Earth. It requires the ability to visualize a better world. At a publishing dinner during the US election campaign of 2016, I told the assembled audience that if you want to know what a non-reader looks like, look at Donald Trump. He lacks imagination, education, compassion, curiosity about other people. He has no personal morality, no respect for history, no knowledge of history, no respect for other people's knowledge and experience, no respect for the rule of law, no respect, in fact, for anything other than power and money. He is a liar and a cheater, a man who famously and proudly has never read a book. The book he wrote that sold millions of copies was written by someone else. He has probably never read it either. Donald Trump cares nothing for the future of the planet or of humanity. He says he wants to make America great again, but his story is entirely about himself. He has no story of hope for the future. Would it make a difference if he read books? Maybe. It could be argued that it is impossible to view the world entirely in black and white if you have read Shakespeare or Hilary Mantel or George Eliot or Maurice Sendak or Roald Dahl or Sean Tan. A friend of mine taught Boris Johnson classics at Oxford. He said he rarely showed up to class, and if he did show up, he immediately fell asleep and stayed asleep until the end. This does not surprise me. It seems to me, and to almost everyone I know, that we are living in a world on the brink of something bad. Whether that something will be another world war starting in Ukraine, or catastrophic species extinction, or mass migration due to climate change. We already have widespread social deprivation and rampant populism. As a society, we have canaries in our coal mine who detect poison gas before we can smell it. They are the canaries who will warn us that we will die if we do not stop doing what we are doing. Those canaries are children, and the canaries are showing the strain. The incidence of mental illness among young people is at an all-time high. The Millennium Cohort Study, carried out in 2021 and published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, followed the lives of 19,000 young people born at the start of the millennium in Great Britain. Its results told us that 7% of children have attempted suicide by the age of 17, and almost 1 in 4 say they have self-harmed in the past year. This is before the COVID pandemic and lockdown. Violent pornography is now a standard form of sex education for children as young as 8 or 9. And in October 2019, according to an article in Forbes magazine, the UK government abandoned its plans to introduce a nationwide age verification system for online pornography. This despite agreeing that adult content is too easily accessed online and more needs to be done to protect children from harm. Today, more than ever, it seems that children are overprotected by their parents and underprotected by governments, funneled by schools and groomed by education to conform to a capitalist model of attainment that favors self-interest, consumption, and economic growth over the creation of a better world. Meanwhile, the climate crisis, passive screen culture, fake news, and the rise of online pornography have quietly become the major behind-the-scenes influencers on everything from brain development to body image to gender dysphoria. A great many children feel hopeless. They literally lack hope. For someone who writes books and whose major mechanism of understanding the world has always been reading, the decline of reading for pleasure seems particularly cruel. I have spent entire weeks and months of my life in retreat from the world, buried in a book, thinking. While I was in that other place, I was building a bank of knowledge, courtesy of other people, people older and wiser than myself, people whose job it is to think, and to turn that thinking into a story. It is, for me, a lifelong glorious respite and a lifelong glorious education. And yet thinking is a luxury. It goes against the grain of a docile capitalist society. Governments do not want citizens to think. They want citizens to work, to follow the rules, citizens who don't ask too many questions or make difficult demands. Faced with the gap between rich and poor, soaring energy and food prices, a racist police force, our abysmal policy on refugees, the last thing power wants is for people to hit the streets. The very, very last thing they want is revolution. How do governments create a compliant population? They start with children. In a 2014 book entitled Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life, award-winning American essayist and educator William Dershowitz addressed what's going on at the top level of American education. This is at the top level. He writes, "Our system of education manufactures young people who are smart and talented and driven, but also anxious, timid, and lost, with little intellectual curiosity and a stunted sense of purpose. They are great at what they're doing, but with no idea why they're doing it. These talented children go up with no motive to question the status quo, no motive to question the structure of society or the emphasis that society puts on a very specific kind of success. If you win a beauty contest, you don't dedicate your life to challenging society's perceptions of beauty." Dershowitz continues, "So extreme are the admission standards that kids who get into elite universities have, by definition, never experienced anything but success. The prospect of not being successful terrifies them, disorientates them. The cost of falling short, even temporarily, becomes not merely practical, but existential. The result is a violent aversion to risk. All of this is happening at exactly the moment at which the world most needs risk takers, individuals willing and able to retell the story of society in a more positive way, to take risks with social, political, and scientific change, to find solutions and to find reasons for hope. Hardly anyone would disagree that our political system needs changing. Free market capitalism has led to terrifying extremes of wealth and poverty. The legal system favors those with money, as does policing, education, housing, and medical care. In the meantime, there is, if it can be believed, still little financial motive to stem or even to acknowledge the devastating effects of global warming. I had an extraordinary conversation last year with a man who invests my retirement fund. I'd like to sell all my holdings in fossil fuels, I told him. But they're making you so much money, he said. The pain in his voice was evident. Still, I insisted, I want to sell. He had one last plea. Think of your daughter, he said. How can you justify reducing her inheritance? And I wanted to say, how can I justify investing in companies who have, for decades, continued knowingly to destroy my daughter's future? But I didn't, because it wouldn't have impressed him. I, like many members of my generation, are carrying the guilt for a lifetime of heedless overconsumption, and most of us want to do something, even something as small as not investing in fossil fuels. It is difficult to think of a single aspect of life on Earth today that couldn't do with rigorous deconstruction and rethinking. If schools are going to train a better class of political leaders, entrepreneurs, scientists, parents, and social policymakers, we have to ask ourselves which qualities we want to promote in the next generation. If we require a more compassionate, more radical, less class-riven and self-centered definition of success, where does it begin? I am, of course, hopelessly prejudiced, but I believe that at least some of it begins with books. We can be lectured till the cows come home about the dangers of right-wing paternalistic power structures, but Margaret Atwood's book, The Handmaid's Tale, instantly allowed us to imagine exactly where those power structures might lead us. Everyone who hasn't read it should read Ursula Le Guin's story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It's only 5 pages long. Omelas is about a perfect utopia in which everyone lives in contented bliss, thanks to the perpetual and horrible suffering of a single child. Read Le Guin's story, and you will never think about the civilized world again without also thinking about the scapegoats. Every person who reads Catch-22, Beloved, Anne Frank's Diary, or Wolf Hall takes a step closer to leading an examined life and a step further away from living life as an excellent sheep. I have frequently wished that a successful person could be redefined as a person who thinks creatively and laterally, who questions authority and accepted wisdom, who lives thoughtfully, generously, and not entirely for personal gain, whose goal is to leave the world a little bit better. How do we do this? By encouraging each new generation to read history and philosophy and fiction, to think big thoughts about religion, politics, ethics, love, passion, life, death, the origins, and the future of the universe. Change will not happen by thinking about what we are, but by what we might be. At the start of lockdown, I gave an entire month over to the last of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall series. It's a big book and a complicated book. And as I neared the end of it, I read late into the night until at 2 a.m., Thomas Cromwell was betrayed and arrested. This is not a spoiler, this is history. My husband had gone to bed hours ago, and I didn't have the heart to wake him, but I was absolutely devastated. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling in a state of shock and despair for most of the night, despite knowing perfectly well from the beginning of book 1 what happens at the end of book 3. Thomas Cromwell is executed by order of Henry VIII. It's history. But the suddenness of the arrest and my attachment to Thomas Cromwell made it feel like a punch to the gut. It turned my heart over and my emotions upside down in a way that the real world rarely does. I have made it a matter of public record that I was more upset by the death of Thomas Cromwell than I was by the deaths of certain members of my family. The ability to engage in the ideas of history is one of the greatest gifts of reading. And as we all know, those who do not study the past are doomed to repeat it. The competition to reading is formidable. We know that. Netflix, computer games, Instagram, Twitter, influencers, celebrities writing books, publishers turning out books whose sole purpose is to offer children a momentary sugar rush, without thought, without real content, without intellectual nutrition. My hope is that children will continue to learn about anarchy from The Cat in the Hat, Injustice from the Secret Garden, and The Story of the Little Mole, and about good versus evil from Harry Potter. They will read Noughts and Crosses or The Giver and imagine a different world. The books you read as a child teach you about the forces of darkness and goodness. They tell you how important it is to think uneasy, difficult thoughts and to change the world. They teach you not to be helpless. The book that influenced me most in my early teens was a book called, I've gone completely blank. What was it called? Madeleine L'Engle's, oh God. Anyway, there is a bit in this book, I will remember it, where Meg, who is the main character, I wonder why I identified so strongly, is given the gift of her faults, A Wrinkle in Time, sorry. She rejects the gift of her faults. I don't want my faults, she says, but she's told that it's her faults that may be her strongest allies in life. Her unruly thoughts, her passion, her unwillingness to conform. I've remembered that idea about the importance of faults throughout my entire life. We are taught endlessly that it's our good qualities that will help us through life, but it's not. That's a lie. We need our faults as much as we need our good qualities. And I learned that through a children's book. The older I get, the more I realize that engagement with real life is great and important, but engagement with the inside of your head is the most important thing of all. It's subversive and it's dangerous, and it's where the really deep ideas are born. My favorite children's books talk about all the same things my favorite adult books talk about: power, love, identity, friendship, cruelty, inequity, and death. Kids are desperate to understand all these things. They seek intensity, big emotions, big ideas. As I settle into my 60s, the intensity in life comes unsought from parents and partners and friends who are ill or dying, people with too much money or not enough, divorces, children or grandchildren with autism or addictions or mental health issues. These days, in other words, though I appreciate books for any number of reasons, and I read a great deal with a great deal of pleasure, it is very rare that a book affects me to the degree that Wolf Hall series did. It's rare that any books affect me to the degree that most of what I was reading when I was 15 affected me. It's not that books have lost their power, rather that my relationship with them has become less urgent. When I was 5 and 10 and 15, I read books over and over again, hundreds of times. They carved deep roads in my brain that determine who I am now. So as a writer, I try to pass it forward. As a writer, I can explore all those deep, dark issues like love and war and existential angst and sex and identity and the future of the planet, offering readers a place where they can consider how difficult the world is, feel the pain, but also feel the consolations of love and work and friendship and the power of hope. Think harder is what I try to say with my books. And I try to remember what C.S. Lewis said about books for children when I apologize about writing them. He says, it's usual to speak in a playfully apologetic tone about adult enjoyment of what are called children's books. I think the convention is a silly one. No book is really worth reading at the age of 10, which is not equally and often far more worth reading at the age of 50. The only books we ought to grow out of are those which it would have been better not to have read at all. How the future of the planet looks depends on children. It is vitally important to take their minds seriously. We know that if you fill a child's mind with pornography, conformity, and lies, that it will stick. Garbage in, garbage out. But bring them up to question authority, to understand the power that resides in their own heads, the power to write a new story for the future, and the world actually has a chance. I am trying to teach children to be anarchists. There cannot be a more important job than that. Thank you very much.
So wonderful speech. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Hit home. I think they inspire us and chill us at the same time. I certainly feel like I have a lot to think about, and my instinct is to find a quiet room where I can sit with everything you've said, because we realize the urgency that comes across in your work and also in your talk this morning. And I'd just like to start the discussion by going back to your framework of hope, and how hope is perhaps the most important story we tell ourselves. And of course, the corollary to hope is despair. And one of the things that strikes me and also my students when we read your work in class is how your characters negotiate hope and despair, and how as a writer you don't hold back from allowing them the intensity of each of those emotions. And so I wonder what your process is, your dialogue with yourself when you're creating these characters. I had to put How I Live Now down 2 or 3 times before I could get to the end, because it was so powerful. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that process of dialogue with the characters as they come into existence.
You know, I have a friend who says that that people write about the time in their life where they got stuck. So there are women who write endlessly about affairs and divorce. There are people who write endlessly about university. I have well, I mean, he's a friend, but he's also quite famous. Anthony Horowitz wrote for a very long time about being 8 years old, because that's how old he was when his father died, leaving all his money in Swiss bank accounts, and the family was sort of hurled into poverty. I write about adolescence because I was a very clever child, but I stopped being able to understand the world when I hit about 10 or 11 years old, when my mother told me all about growing up and having babies and getting periods and all that. I cried for about 4 days. I didn't really want to grow up. I didn't really understand the rules of growing up. And I consider that my entire life has been coming to terms with what it means to be a grown-up. And I think the world has it completely wrong. The idea that adolescence takes place between the ages of 11 and 19 seems to me to be a ridiculous closing off of philosophical development. But I certainly, when I was younger, I imagined that at 19 or 18, I would go to university, I would graduate from university, and then I would be a grown-up. So that I would get married, I would have children, I would have a job. My whole life would be more or less orderly after that. Of course, it doesn't happen that way. A lot of us remain adolescents well into our 60s. We're asking the same questions over and over again. What will I do with my life? Who am I? Will anyone ever love me? You know, how can I leave the world in a better state than I entered it? These are the big questions that we ask repeatedly through life. So when I'm engaging in, as you say, a dialogue with my characters, I'm actually engaging in an argument with life. My books are not ideas that I have that I then set down on paper, fully formed. I'm trying to figure things out as I write. I'm trying desperately to understand love or friendship, questions I still struggle with at the age of 65. So, a lot of my friends in their 50s and 60s are divorcing people they've been married to for many years. They're changing jobs that they've had for 25, 30 years. And they're back in the same place they were when they were 16. They're saying, what can I do with my life? Who am I? Will anybody ever love me? So it's not like these questions have easy answers. They have difficult answers. And so when I sit down to write a book, when I sat down to write How I Live Now, I thought, what would it be like? I mean, it turned out to be, obviously it was prescient. I was watching the war in the former Yugoslavia when I started thinking about that book. We're watching the same thing happening again in Ukraine. People like us, which is again a terrible human quality, but we somehow managed to identify more with people who look like us. And I had recently moved to the UK, away from that kind of separatism that America has. And suddenly I was watching every night on the news, people who spoke beautiful English, people like me, people like my husband, my family, who were saying, we are at war with our neighbors. What does that feel like? To me, it felt important to grapple with that over there syndrome, that bad things happen somewhere else. Of course, it's not true. When you live in Europe, you realize how untrue that is. But growing up in America, so many things happened over there. Of course, what's happening in America now is that people are coming into your children's school with automatic rifles. They're not happening over there. They're happening all the time where they live. And I suppose if I still lived in America, I would be, talking more about those issues. So my characters are myself, really, with very few exceptions. I think possibly the only exception of one of my main characters who isn't myself in some form is the 19-year-old God in There Is No Dog. Is that the right one? Yeah. And instead in that book, I'm the minor character, Mr. B, who is his support. Yeah, I mean, the dialogue is with myself. And I think, myself as the teenager I was, myself as the teenager I still am.
I think possibly we have some questions from the audience.
Hi there, Meg. I have heard you speak before in real life, but that was just an absolutely amazing speech for me personally. It resonated with everything I've been thinking about and think in the life that we're living at the moment, both at a personal level and at a wider issues level. Internationally, I think the things we're going through are just really devastating. But you put it, you're not just a writer, very evidently. You're just so eloquent, and the way that you've just narrated, really, you've told us a story. It made me cry, actually. It made me smile. It made me feel very upset inside. My tummy's churning over. And I thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Oh, that's quite extraordinary to hear. I really wanted to talk today because really, in a funny way, my most natural environment is less book festivals than it is academic conferences. I'm really interested in questions that bother me. One thing that bothers me, I said at the beginning of this talk that I went to the it was a reception for writers at Hatchard's in London. And I found myself doing that thing again of apologizing for writing children's books. And I've talked about that in a humorous way a number of times, but I wanted really to grapple with the idea of, why do I have to apologize? Why is it considered a lower form of writing? And, weirdly enough, and much to my, I have to say, annoyance, it took me much, much longer to write this talk than I expected it to. Normally I can write a keynote in a few days. I more or less know what I want to talk about. This actually took me, the better part of weeks, because I wrote it the way I write my books. I started with this idea, why do I have to apologize so much? Why do people always say to me, when are you going to write for adults? Why don't I just proudly say, no, I write for children. Children are the most important people in the world. And I came up with this idea that the British government hates children. And I think there is a lot of truth in that. And it's a terrible, terrible truth to realize. Governments want to create citizens who will vote for them. They don't really care about the education and the expansion of children's minds. And of course, that makes what we do as people who study children's books and who are children's writers even that much more important. This is teachers, obviously, teachers are absolutely amazing, but they are being more and more boxed in the way that they teach. They're having to teach to exams. They're teaching children to synthetic phonics so they can read a sentence by year one. But, governments have no idea what teaching is about. They have no idea what the importance of expanding children's minds. So I'm very moved that you were very moved. It is important. It is important to grapple with these subjects.
Meg, I don't know if you can see the room or the faces, but I think Janet expressed the emotion of everybody here. It's palpable. Literally, I think
I can see the
haven't been more hands raised because we're processing. We started the conference yesterday and the discussions have been great, but perhaps they have been soft and gentle and not overly hopeful, but we're also glad to be here after the pandemic in person. And I think you've grounded us, and perhaps the real work starts now, even digging deeper into the presentations we heard yesterday. We've been celebrating each other and this community, as you say, but you've reminded us that we've got work to do and not much time to dilly-dally around the real issues. So any other comments from the, yes, so Justina, and then we'll come around.
Thank you so much. I agree with Janet, absolutely. And myself working on utopianism for quite a long time on utopianism, children's literature and culture, I must say that what I'm grappling with now, and thank you very much for trying to kind of dissect also this tension between despair and hope. I think that as scholars, we are, especially children's literature scholars, maybe we are kind of pressed indeed to feel hopeful and to, and I mean pressed that there is this expectation that we believe in a better future. We need to talk to children. We need to spread the word about books that present hopeful visions of a future. But I think, and it's fine, but I think at the same time, just witnessing what is going on around, it's getting a bigger and bigger challenge to remain hopeful and optimistic. So thank you very much for acknowledging the other side of this despair, this doubt, maybe the frustration. And this is something that I've been really thinking a lot recently. I mean, how can I even think about, like, in utopian terms and believe in the possibility of utopia? And I do agree, Le Guin's text is very powerful here, very powerful critique of how we can ever achieve or move towards a utopian world. Indeed. So yeah, coming back to it's a comment, really, maybe an acknowledgement than a question, but I think we really need to pay attention as well to the hard, difficult feelings, that affects that we are experiencing. But then, okay, great.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. And, you know, I think.
Great. Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah, so I just wanted to, I just want to once again to acknowledge, oh, sorry, got distracted.
Of me, but you've disappeared off the big screen. We're working on it now. Just there you
oh
are.
yeah. Once again, well, but I think I've said what I wanted to say.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
I mean, I think, you know, I learned. Oh. Can I respond to that for just 1 second? You know, I learned about existentialism and nihilism and all that when I was a teenager. And of course, you know, teenagers do dabble with that kind of despair. I think as human beings, we're so desperately flawed as a race. But the one thing that does save us is this ability, you know, where does it come from? But somewhere in our brains, to retain that aspect of hope. And I think, you know, children are on the sharp edge of hope. Children are the brains that we can change. You can't change the mind of politicians. It's a nightmare. You know, I used to be very proud of having an American and a UK passport. Now I'd like to burn both of them. Though I'm not sure where I would go. But, you know, children are the people who you can talk to about hope, who you can, you know, inculcate with this idea that change is possible. And so what the job we're all doing is a ridiculously important job.
Thank you. No?
Thank you so much for this powerful speech. And I have two comments, actually. The first one is this a comment to why you have to explain yourself over and over again that you are a children's or adolescent's writer, not a grown-up writer. Well, I think that what you feel is this lack of respect to children in general, something that was discussed 100 years ago and it's still discussed and it doesn't change, that children's life doesn't really matter. They are not subject, and that's why the literature you are writing and the science research we are doing has this, you know, stigma of being children, not fully developed citizens, not citizens at all. They don't count, so we and our work doesn't count either. And I would take it as a constant reminder that this is something we should change, you know, the attitude towards children in general. When you said that the governments hate children, and I'm from Poland, and I have to say that our government hates children also, I think that generally the adult world still somehow hates children. That we are overprotective as parents, yes, but ethically, we still don't respect children and their voice. And why do we don't do that? Because it's hard. you know, because facing children and their worldview is hard, inconvenient, and we have institutions, procedures. We don't need that. And it really shows in children's art. I'm interested not only in children's literature, but children's theater as well. What you said about being a children's writer with responsibility, you as the constant adolescent, and, you know, provoking to those resilient thoughts and subversive thoughts, but not most of children's literature published today doesn't do that. Yeah. You know, most of the children's literature like encourages to be like, you know, ordinary. To you said yourself, it's sugared, it's cuddly and cozy and so on. So we give the children this chaotic, you know, miasma of good literature, bad literature, sugar literature, true literature, fake literature. This is something really hard to navigate among for a grown-up, for a parent, and for children also. So the world we are like giving them is like ethically very bad, I would say, not only in the climate changes perspective, but also in everyday literature perspective. So maybe the way of going away and escape it is, you know, the virtual world, which is free. Yes. You know, in some perspective, it's dangerous, but it's also free. They have their agency there somehow, which is also can be questioned also philosophically, of course. But anyways, so this was my comment, and thank you for your speech, because it really resonates with what I think about adulthood and childhood recently, which is like also provoked by this world crisis we're living in right now. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for that comment. I think that's I mean, what you said, something so important, that it's not just the British government that hates children. I think children are so trivialized, you know, across the world. Interestingly, the person who, I mean, I didn't really set out to write children's books. It wasn't a conscious decision. It's what I ended up writing. And of course, that tells me that that's what I was interested in. But when I was awarded the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, I was given a copy of Astrid Lindgren's pamphlet, which she gave as a speech in Frankfurt, I think, or maybe they didn't allow her to give it. And it's called Never Violence. And she spent years of her life trying to get physical punishment of children banned in Sweden. And Sweden was the first country in the world that banned hitting children. And she talked really, she was the first person who really made me understand how trivialized children really are. And I think it is because they're a threat. They are anarchic. You know, their brains, they don't understand the rules of being an excellent sheep. And that makes them dangerous. And, you know, there is a kind of, if you try to get a sort of mind picture of what as society we're trying to do with children, it's to get them on a narrower path, you know, to try to iron out the more extreme characteristics of children. And, you know, it's wrong. It's a very, very wrong thing to do. You know, those extreme characteristics in children are one of the most valuable elements and you know, weapons in a way that we have for the betterment of society. But yes, I mean, it's again, it seems to be one of those things in human brains that we trivialize children. You know, can we ever change that? You know, what can you do? You can try. You can but try.
Thank you, Meg. Tina, did you?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Meg, for this powerful, powerful lecture. I feel my heart is beating very loudly. And I think that you mentioned before, and forgive me if I'm wrong, a masterpiece of a historical novel, actually a series of books, Wolf Hall. And I would like to ask you, what is your opinion about history and the ways a contemporary author for children or young adults can appropriate history, especially modern history, in their books, and in what ways also history could possibly help us to understand better the now, and even to foresee even a part, let's say, of the future. Thank you.
That's a difficult question. I mean, history is very much not my subject. You know, I was educated in America. We were taught about World War II, you know, in America. And, you know, I can barely remember anything else I was taught about history. Most of the history I've learned has been as an adult, and most of it has been because I'm not very good at sitting down with a massive history book, has been through fiction. So, for instance, the best book I've ever read about the Holocaust, or, you know, was Primo Levi's book, If This Is a Man. You know, I know that The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is used to teach World War II history to children. I have problems with that book. And, you know, in the book Thief as well. I mean, there are, you know, some good books written for children. But I do think there is a tendency to sentimentalize books for children. In a way, I would rather have them read the Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, because, you know, it's not sentimentalized. It is actually about her life hiding in an attic. And I suppose, I mean, you know, I don't keep up with YA literature, it must be said. Mostly because I find so much of it so disappointing. Actually, there's a guy called Morris Gleitzman in Australia. I don't know what he's doing lately, but when I first started writing, he wrote a series of books on World War II called Once, Then, and Then Now, which wasn't as good, but Once and Then were incredibly powerful books. You know, I mean, the great thing for us about being teachers and gatekeepers and academics is that we get to choose the books we think, you know, should be read more. Unfortunately, I don't think they are read more. You know, I think kids will read Diary of a Wimpy Kid, you know, given a choice. But then, you know, when I was a kid, I remember the happiest day of my life was when somebody gave me a pile 3 feet high of comic books. You know, actually it cured me of comic books because I'd only ever had one at a time, one a week, one a month. And suddenly I had about 100 of them. But, you know, it's like, you know, when I go to get my hair cut, the guy talks endlessly. Have you watched this on Netflix? Have you watched this? Have you watched this? Have you watched this? And he goes, oh, no, it's really addictive. And I go, I know it's addictive. I am so susceptible to being addicted to, you know, trashy stuff on television, which is why I don't start it, because I don't want to spend my time doing that. but I also know that that reading is more challenging. Reading history is difficult, and it requires a different kind of engagement than sitting in front of a screen or sitting in front of a TV. And I also think it's a rare teacher, and we all know this, who can make any subject really sing. And we all remember the teachers we've had who did that. I have a friend who years ago was admitted to Oxford to study medicine, but she went to a summer program the summer before and did a course on classics. And she was so absolutely blown away by this teacher of classics that she changed her major and studied classics for 4 years. And then when she finished, she said she was like a princess awaking from a spell. She realized that she wanted to study medicine, so she had to go back and start all over again and study medicine from the beginning. And I met that teacher recently. I met that guy who taught her classics. He's now 80. And he is the most extraordinary man. There are individuals who can, who can affect that kind of change. Unfortunately, I never had a history teacher who really engaged me very much in history, but I can't quite remember what the question was, but yeah, I think there are probably some good writers for children who are writing about history. I know there are people writing, rewriting American history to include Native Americans and the Black population and slavery and all that kind of stuff. And I think children's books are at the forefront of changing ideas. I mean, I remember, 8 or 10 years ago, that the whole idea of gender fluidity and trans culture and all that kind of stuff really was starting in children's books. And, when I say children, I mean young adult type books, before it was really in the mainstream. So there is a vanguard of books for children and young adults. And we just, I'm a terrible, terrible literary snob. And I'm getting worse and worse as I get older, because of course I've read thousands and thousands of books, and my tolerance for bestsellers and for books that people say, oh, this is really great, you're going to love this, it gets lower and lower as I get older. But I know there are books that don't meet my criteria that children do love, and that aren't just sugar.
We have time for one last question, Svetlana. Is that okay, Meg? Just
yes,
one last.
yes,
You've been so
yeah.
generous with your time. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank you for this amazing talk. You inspired us all in the room. As Giuliana pointed out, I mean, expression of our faces is actually telling about the depth of your talk and emotions that you raised. Actually, you just mentioned and you qualified yourself as a, I quote, terrible literary snob. Regarding that, I have a question, because you mentioned something in your talk that I actually experienced personally with my students, that everything changed. So fashion changed, language changed, the world changed. So we can't offer today's children like classics from 19th century. They're not communicating with that. So actually I gave to my students to do some sort of experiment to offer to pupils of the last grade of primary school, let's say children of 14 years, to offer them one Charles Dickens novel, and to offer them one really, really good novel of one contemporary Serbian writer, like young adult novel. And of course, the reaction for Dickens was very mild, and they didn't get it, and they reacted so well to this other novel. So it was, I mean, kind of expected reaction. But my question is, if we should just drop off classics and find other solutions. Could adaptations of classic in some modern way could be some sort of solution to connect ancient, let's say, times with today's moment? And I mean, the idea of not introducing them in some way to this amazing tradition, which was foundation for everything that came later, in a way, for me, it's a little bit frightening. But on the other way, I really can't ignore the fact that they are not communicating with that time, with that language, with that atmosphere, and with, let's say, with preoccupations of that time. So according to you, what could be the best possible solution?
Oh, if only I knew. I mean, I have no idea what the answer to that is. I mean, I had a wonderful, wonderful teacher of Shakespeare when I was 16 and 17. And I think that gave me a lifelong love of Shakespeare in a way that the person who taught me at university, the basic Shakespeare course I took, and I went to Harvard, you know, it should have been a really good course. It was a terrible, terrible course. So, you know, it can be one person with enthusiasm who can introduce a child, you know, to classics from the past. But, you know, I read books like, you know, Anne of Green Gables, which is considered the great classic in American or Canadian or whatever it is literature, to my daughter, and I had to edit it as I read. It was way too, it had too many words for modern children. She just wasn't really as interested. And I mean, I studied Pride and Prejudice, which is supposed to be the great, you know, novel in the English language when I was in my early 20s. And to be honest, I didn't really engage with it. And I didn't really engage with it until I was in my 40s and realized that it was a book as much about money and class as it was about love. So, you know, what is the answer? I mean, I failed physics in school. I mean, I couldn't get my head around, you know, what physics was about. I never studied chemistry. You know, there's a limited amount of time in everybody's life to learn. In fact, I actually have a theory about education. Here's my solution. I haven't been able to preach about this in a long time. I think everyone should be given 16 years of education that they're allowed to use anytime from about the age of, you have to go to school till you're 15. Then you get another 16 years sometime that you can use in 4-year blocks throughout your life. And then you can take up the study of some of these things when you're really ready to do it. So now, you know, I learned most of history through art history because my husband is a painter and we traveled a lot in Italy. And you know, suddenly history started making much more sense to me through paintings. So I would very much like to study history now. But, you know, life gets hold of you and you have other things to do and you've got children to raise and, you know, all that kind of stuff, and you don't do it. So that's my solution: 16 years of education that you can use whenever you choose.
Thanks, Meg. Everyone's smiling, so. Meg, I know I speak on behalf of everyone when I thank you for blowing not only our minds wide open, but also our hearts wide open. We knew that you were going to give us a stimulating talk, but this has been absolutely superb. And I thank you for taking so much time in preparing it. I know you were busy with other projects too, and for making space for this conference. And we'll carry your words on with us as we continue our discussion. So please join me in thanking Meg once more. for a brilliant talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Meg, of course, you're welcome to stay with us online. We are moving now into panel discussions, but I know you must be busy too. So we'll say goodbye now, but feel free to stay on. Thank you so much, Megan. I'll be in touch after the conference as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Such a good, nice response. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Meg. Speak soon.
Okay,
Bye
bye-bye.
for now.